Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are making up for the lost time of last week. We are talking about the lab material from week number 5. We are going to wrap up the histology packet, but we're actually going to start here in the integument, which is the skin. So we began our time together in a group work setting to introduce ourselves to the skin, or the integument. Your skin that you see when you look in the mirror or when you look down at your hands, you're actually looking at the outermost layer of tissue, though the skin is actually made of multiple different layers. So when I say the integument, or when I say the skin, I actually mean everything from the outside, which is called the epidermis, all the way down through this underlying layer called the hypodermis. Or sometimes, as one of my groups pointed out to me, sometimes we call that hypodermis the subcutaneous layer. The subcutaneous layer. This name here, sub, means underneath, and the cutaneous layer is the skin. So the hypodermis and the subcutaneous layer, they're exactly the same thing. I believe on your tissue location and function guide, this is what it's called. Let's work our way though from the outside, the epidermis, down through to this innermost layer, the hypodermis. I'll mention now, and we'll see this a few other times too, this beginning part right here called the epi prefix. Epi means above. So the epidermis is the outermost layer that is above the part of your skin that's called the dermis. And below the dermis, we have the hypodermis. Remember from unit number 1, when we're talking about concentrations, we said that hypotonic was a low concentration. So the hypodermis is the lowest layer of tissue. It's below the dermis. So if we start above the dermis, the epidermis, this is the outermost layer of your skin. Can you remind me in the chat, which specific kind of tissue do we find in the epidermis, the outermost layer of the skin? Kira has magic fingers. They type super fast. I realized as I was asking that question, that's a mean one for me to ask, right? It's a long answer. I'll type it here in on our slide and we'll talk about all the parts of its name. So the name of the type of tissue that I find in the epidermis is called keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. I put epithelium in all caps for us because here's an important thing for us to keep in mind. In the body, we have 4 main types of tissues. There's 4 types. So far, a couple weeks back when we last had lab, we looked at 2 of those 4 types. We looked at the epithelial tissues, which are things like this keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. What was the other main tissue type that we looked at a couple weeks ago? Do you remember what that other main tissue type was? Yeah, that other main tissue type that we looked at was connective tissue. Connective tissue, absolutely. Between epithelium and connective tissue, that is the vast majority of the types of tissue that we have in the body. They fall into those 2 categories. We have very few new kinds of tissue to look at today. The 2 main types that we have left are muscle tissue and nervous tissue. So there are 4 main types of tissue in the body. Epithelial tissue, which if you remember with epithelial tissue, its name is going to tell me a whole lot about it. We also have connective tissue. This was the kind that there were all kinds of different appearances to it, connective tissue. And then today we'll look at, there's 3 types of muscle tissue and 1 category of nervous tissue. So not a lot of new tissues for us to look at today. Let's go back to our only epithelial tissue that's found in the skin. If you remember from our discussion of epithelial tissue in general, this is called the covering and lining tissue. So it covers the outside of you and it lines the inside of you. So it should be no surprise when we're thinking about our tissue types that the one I find on the outside of the body, covering the outside of you, is epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue that covers the outside of you, that makes up the epidermis, it's called stratified squamous. Let's start with this stratified word. What does this stratified word mean when we say stratified squamous? Yeah, stratified is a word that we use to talk about the number of layers. Stratified is a layers word. So stratified means we have at least 2 layers. Stratified. Some of the types of tissue that we looked at that were epithelial tissue, some of them were called simple epithelium. No worries, Alpina. Feel free to pop out if you need to, not a problem. Some of our epithelial tissues are called simple epithelium. What is that? What does that word simple mean in an epithelial tissue? It's not stratified, it's simple. Yeah, simple is the opposite kind of stratified. Simple means that we have 1 layer, 1 layer. You would not want to have simple epithelium on the outside of your body because there would just be 1 layer of cells. And if you ever bumped into something or ever scratched something, you would have no epithelium left. So it's really good for us to have multiple layers on the outside of the body. Stratified squamous epithelium. The other part of the name of this tissue, besides just stratified, is this squamous word here. And this is going to refer to the shape of our cells. What are some of the ways that you would describe what squamous looks like? What does squamous look like? Yeah, so I see a couple of us mentioning in our chat here, these are our squished cells. Absolutely, I love that. These are going to be really flat. They're going to be kind of spread out and thin. So it's hard to tell on this picture. We're going to look at some other ones where you can see it better. But each, like this little kind of dark line that you see right here, this is a single cell thick. There's all kinds of cells above it and below it, but it is a very squished cell, really flat cell. All of this is those squished flat cells. Yeah, I like it. They kind of look like crepes or pancakes. Absolutely. So that's my squamous shape. And we're stratified, meaning there's a whole bunch. We got a big old stack of pancakes going on outside the body. But here's why we wouldn't want to eat these pancakes that we have outside the body, because these pancakes are keratinized. Keratinized. I can't remember. I think we talked about this word, right? Did we talk about what keratinized means? Yeah, Kaylin's right. Hey, they're like super pancakes, right? Like we talked about our cells having so many proteins inside, right? The banana, that's a super banana. So keratinized means I'm filled with keratin. And as we're going to talk about in lecture lesson number 7, keratin makes our cells really tough, makes them really strong, but it also makes them really dead. When you're completely filled with keratin, you are dead. So keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, we've got multiple layers of pancake cells that are really strong and tough, but also really dead. That's what the name of this type of tissue tells us, keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. We find that in the epidermis, which is the outermost layer of the skin. With keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, keep in mind that its function is going to be protection. specifically protection from things like bacteria or other kinds of microbes, but also the big one with keratinized stratified squamous epithelium is UV, like Kira was mentioning. Absolutely. What makes keratinized stratified squamous epitheliums function different from non-keratinized? Look for that keyword, UV protection. Because when we talk about the other kind of big pancake stack cells that we find in places like your mouth, for example, you don't usually have sunlight that's getting into your mouth, usually. So we don't need to have UV protection. One of the things that this keratin protein helps us with is with protection from UV. So big difference in their function is whether or not we have UV protection. In non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, it still protects you against rubbing. It still protects you against bacteria. It's just not going to be any good at UV protection. Right underneath this layer here called the epidermis, we have this little undulating layer that goes up and down called the papillary layer of the dermis. The papillary layer of the dermis. Do we remember from our location and function guide which type of connective tissue we find in the papillary layer of the dermis? It is a connective tissue. Yeah, so Kira's right for us. She'll save us some typing here. Areolar loose connective tissue. Areolar loose connective tissue. This is the kind of connective tissue that we usually talk about is kind of like the prototype or the most basic type of connective tissue. So we've got really loosely arranged proteins and cells. The cells, by the way, that are in this kind of tissue are called fibroblasts, fiber builders. So all of this tissue that's right up here next to the epidermis in this layer called the papillary layer of the dermis, that's called areolar loose connective tissue. Underneath it, we have this much larger layer called the reticular layer of the dermis. And this is the one that Dr. Allis really doesn't like the way that it looks because it's a big hot mess. The reticular layer of the dermis has a type of dense connective tissue. Is it dense, regular, or irregular connective tissue? We're all going with Kira, right? This is a type of dense connective tissue. In particular, this one is dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue. This is the one where some of the proteins stick out of the screen in your face. Some of them go the same direction as the screen. Some of them are at an angle. Dense, irregular connective tissue. Because those proteins are arranged irregularly, because they're going in so many different directions, this kind of tissue is really strong in more than one direction. So that's good for you when you think about moving your fingers to type or to take notes. You're pulling on your skin in all kinds of different directions. Dense, irregular connective tissue has proteins that are arranged in all kinds of directions. That makes them really good for withstanding pulling in all those different directions. Then we go down to the deepest layer of the skin. The deepest layer of the skin is called the hypodermis, or sometimes you see it called the subcutaneous layer of the skin. Either one of these is correct. This term hypodermis, I like it because I think about hypodermal needles, or I think about this beginning part, hypo, for being low, underneath the dermis. We should be able to tell from this picture what kind of tissue we have down here. Can we tell what kind of tissue makes up the hypodermis down here? What's this stuff? Yeah, exactly. This stuff is that type of tissue that if we were in the lab looking at slides together, you can see adipose all over the place. Adipose, loose connective tissue, adipose, loose connective tissues. In fact, one of the places in your body that you have the most adipose connective tissue is actually this hypodermis layer, this layer underneath the skin. So the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer, this is where I find adipose. When I go up one layer into the reticular layer of the dermis, that's where I have dense, irregular connective tissue. Up above that, really close to the outer layer, in the papillary part of the dermis, that's the areolar loose connective tissue. And finally, the very outermost layer of your skin, called keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Now that we have reviewed this, how do we feel about the 4 types of tissue in the skin? Thumbs up, thumbs down, cross-eyed. What do we think? Kira's got the cool glasses on. We're a little less excited than normal. Let me send you a penguin. Are we all still just recovering from last week? Because I could totally feel that. Let's be real. Last week was rough. It's true. Yeah. And we had the exam. Yeah. Or we have the exam still for some of us. So yeah, that's okay. I will try to have as much energy as I can for you all to help us through class today, right? Well, we'll make it through. We got this. I like that, Zaira. Like that chicken. All right. Well, since we're talking about the skin already, let's go ahead and work our way through the skin packet. So we're going to start with, I think this is this page 1 or page 2 for you all, where you have this picture that we see right here. Yeah, Kaylin says not even the penguin can help. I feel ya. All right, well, we're looking at, I think it's probably page 1. Yeah, so we're looking at page 1 from the lesson number 5 packet. Yeah, so you only have this one. I added this one so we can make some comparisons here. This is showing us what the pretty textbook version of the skin looks like compared to a picture of what it actually looks like if we were looking at slides in our lab. So we don't have all the nice color-coded things on our skin like they have in this picture here, but the layers that we see are the same, whether it's in a pretty textbook picture or whether it's on our slides. So let's remind ourselves, on the previous slide, we already named the layers that we can see here. So this outermost layer of the skin out here, what did we call this outermost layer? Not the tissue type, but the region as a whole. What was this outermost part of the skin called? Yeah, exactly. This outermost part is called the epidermis. Epidermis. And if I go over to our picture, I'm going to draw a little bracket for us here. Here's my epidermis on our picture as well. Remember that when you're looking at the epidermis, it's made out of epithelial tissue. And when you were comparing the 4 main tissue types of the skin in the body, epithelial tissue was the type of tissue type that's made entirely of cells. So there's no other, there's no proteins on the outside, there's no space on the outside. The epidermis layer is all cells. So all of this stuff is cells. All of this is the epidermis. Yeah, and I like Audrey's study tip. She always hears the phrase, your epidermis is showing. I love it. That's perfect. That is the layer of your skin that you're seeing. At least I hope that's what you're seeing. Otherwise, we have a really bad blister or a really bad cut or something. So your epidermis is showing, absolutely, this outermost layer of cells. Right underneath it, we've got two regions that are both part of the dermis. This upper part has these things that go up and down, and we're going to talk about these in lecture. These little things, as a note for us a little ahead of time, are called the dermal papillae. The dermal papillae. So this up and down weaving pattern where the dermis goes up and meets the epidermis, and then it goes back down and goes back up. Papillae literally means fingers. So we've got these little fingers that are sticking up in here, dermal papillae. That helps us to remember that the next layer of the skin is called the papillary layer of the dermis. The papillary layer of the dermis. And this is not a very big layer. It really kind of only takes up the space at the very top. Here, I'm drawing you a really crude circle around the other one. Bear with me. So my papillary layer of the dermis on my other image is kind of this space up here, right next to those dermal papillae, where it goes up and down, and then a little bit of space down below, the papillary layer of the dermis. The much bigger part of the dermis is what we see down here. Remind me in the chat, what was that other part of the dermis called? We had the papillary layer on top, and then we had the, yeah, we have that other part called the reticular layer of the dermis. I should clarify that. Reticular layer of the dermis. That's the much larger part of the dermis that we see down here. So the papillary layer, the reticular layer, yeah, and Audrey mentioned our last layer that in this picture we can't really see. Down below all of this stuff would be that hypodermis that we saw on the other slide. And you can maybe see a little bit of it on this slide right here. I think I might see a little bit of it because of the kind of tissue that I see right here. What kind of tissue is this down here that I have in that last layer called the hypodermis? Let me add that to our list. Hypodermis, yeah. The hypodermis has adipose tissue. So it looks like I might be seeing a little bit of adipose tissue down here. If I'm seeing adipose tissue, that's the kind of tissue in the hypodermis. So the lowest layer of the skin, the hypodermis. The reticular layer of the dermis, put a bracket around that over here, is that next region where we have the dense, irregular, the really messy connective tissue. Then we have that smaller papillary layer of the dermis and the epidermis on the outside. So we will ask you on the homework assignment and on the exam to identify these regions of the skin. That's the terminology we're going to use. So regions are the epidermis, the papillary layer of the dermis, the reticular layer of the dermis, and the hypodermis. Those are my regions. More specifically, when we are inside the epidermis region, there are actually some specific layers in it that we also need to be able to identify. Oh, well, so here's the slide we looked at before, right? Check out that big hypodermis right there. So that's the slide, the image we looked at before. Let's zoom in on the epidermis layer up here at the top. So these are a couple of pictures from our slides. I believe you had a space in your packet for you to draw what the skin looked like. So these are a couple of things you'll find in the guided lesson. Yeah, so Kate is pointing out the fact that we can really see in these pictures that these cells are keratinized, totally. See all these little wavy things that kind of look like hairs up here? These are cells that are so full of keratin and so completely dead and flat that they're just kind of like shedding all the time. Remember we talked about how this is what the dust is in your house. It's all of these flat cells that are so skinny. Back in a former life, in a better day, they looked kind of like this, round and plump. And the farther they got away, as they grew and got pushed out, they became these flat, skinny, full of keratin things that we see here. So again, you can see those keratinized cells. Yeah, we're talking about the octopus arms, right? Or yeah, baby hair on a sonogram, all kinds of things that these keratinized cells look like. Absolutely. So these ones totally full of keratin. These ones down below it still alive. Although, as we'll talk about in lecture, this dark line of cells that we see right here, this dark line of cells is when they start to die. So everybody who lives on top, who's falling off, like that baby hair or like the octopus arms, everybody who's fallen off and dying out here, they're beyond this purple layer or this dark layer of cells. So keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Remember, by the way, when we talk about stratified epithelium, you have to go above the very outermost layer. That's the shape. That's how we look for the shape. So these really flat, skinny cells here on the outside, those are the squamous cells. We can't use our shapes down here at the bottom to tell what we're looking at here. That epidermis layer with those cells that we looked at, sometimes it's really thin and there's not a lot of space, but there are some places in your body where we would see a lot more layers, kind of more like this. So this is, as the guided lesson talks about, this is an example of what thick skin looks like. Thick skin is the kind of skin you got on places like the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet, where I need all the layers of cells. If I tried to count the number of layers of cells that I had in this picture, we can be in the ballpark of like 50 to 100 different layers of cells when we're looking at this tissue. Compare this picture, I'm going to bounce back here for a moment. Compare this picture to these ones that we just looked at. This is all the layers of cells that we're seeing. So maybe we've got like 10 layers of cells here. When we have thin skin, this is showing us thin skin, which is what covers most of your body, we don't have nearly as many layers on it. And the layer that's going to be the most different between thin skin and thick skin is this outermost layer. The outermost layer is way bigger when we talk about thick skin compared to what we see in thin skin here. So thin skin, you can see all of it really easily. We can zoom in super close. These pictures taken using our high power objective, our blue objective, we can zoom all the way in and see the entire epidermis. This picture here was taken using the low power objective, the yellow objective. With that, I can see all of my layers. But if I tried to zoom in super close, I wouldn't be able to see everybody because there's so many layers of cells. Let's go through and talk about what we call each of these layers of cells. So this is the model that you have a picture of that shows you these layer names. We're going to label it here and we're going to correlate it to what we actually see on a tissue image. So we're going to start down at the very bottom, the bottommost layer down here. When we talk about the layers of the skin, the layers are called a stratum. Let me start with that. Stratum is a layer. So each of these layers has a particular name. They all start with stratum. So I've got my stratum here at the bottom, or the basement layer. The lowest layer of the epidermis is called stratum basal. Stratum basal. And stratum basal is actually one layer of cells. One layer of cells down at the very bottom. This one layer of cells is where the epidermis meets the papillary layer of the dermis down below it. Now, stratum basal is really important because this is the part of the skin where we actually do mitosis. Stratum basal is where your skin does mitosis. Does anyone remember what happened in mitosis? What's going on in mitosis? where mitosis happens. Stratum basal. Move that. Yeah, seems like it was a year ago, right? That was a very long time ago. Yeah. Mitosis is our process of dividing up DNA. We couple that with cytokinesis to make new cells. So we're constantly losing cells, which means we constantly have to be making cells. Stratum basal is the layer where we constantly make cells. Stratum basal. So stratum basal, one row of cells. It's just one layer thick. Yeah, so Audrey asked, where do we go from here? So when these cells divide, they make a new cell that pushes up into my next layer of the skin. My next layer is actually much larger. Stratum basal is one row of cells. My next layer is all of these ones that we see here. This next group of cells, or this next layer, is what we call stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum. So I'm going to put a little bracket around that over here. Stratum spinosum is all of these cells. They formed because my cells that lived in stratum basal, they basically pushed off a new cell up into stratum spinosum. So stratum spinosum gets its name because if we could zoom all the way in on these cells, we might actually see them looking kind of spiny, or like they're attached to each other with little points because they're holding together so tightly. Stratum spinosum on top of stratum basal. Then we hit a layer of cells that's labeled right here. And here I'm going to try to draw a line right underneath it on my other picture. So you can kind of see on top of my black line that I drew over there. The next layer that we're looking at is something called stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum. This one gets its name because the cells are filled with granules, which are basically purple dots. Little purple dots that fill up these cells, making this line of cells here, typically 3 to 5 layers thick. These purple spots, these granules, are going to help these cells be waterproofed. So stratum granulosum is my darker colored cells. By the time we start to get to stratum granulosum, these cells are starting to die. I'm going to skip this one right here. We're going to come back in just a minute because I want to go to the outermost layer of the skin. The outermost layer of the skin is called stratum corneum. Stratum corneum. These are the cells that are cornified, or completely filled with keratin. So this outermost layer of the skin is completely dead, which is why I always like to joke with my students, when you put moisturizer on your skin, you're putting it right on top of all these dead skin cells. So it'll do as much as it'll do, but they're all dead anyway. these poor friends out here. So stratum corneum, the outermost layer of the skin. These are all my dead cells. When I have thin skin, there's maybe 10, 15 layers of cells out here. In thick skin, as we can see, tons and tons of layers. The layer that we skipped is, I'm going to put a line in it here and put it over here. The layer that we skipped is a special layer called stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum. And the reason I skipped this one is because stratum lucidum is only seen in thick skin. So it's only seen in places like the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet. Lucidum means lucid or clear. This clear layer of cells are cells that are completely dead, but they're not quite dehydrated yet, which is why they don't look so dark like we see in these layers here. You can see this white line of cells that's right here. All of these cells are dead. They do have a lot of keratin inside of them, but they still have a little bit of fluid. That's why they still look clear. That's why they're stratum lucidum. But then they transition into stratum corneum, where they lose all that fluid and they look like this. Fun thing that I saw online to help you memorize the order that these layers go in. So from outside to inside, here's our phrase. Come, let's get sunburned. Come, let's get sunburned. Can't type. Stratum corneum on the outside, then stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. So when we have thick skin, we've got this extra layer, stratum lucidum, in there. Otherwise, it's just come get sunburned. But if we're being very polite and we're burning our thick skin too, come let's get sunburned. So stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. A fun little mnemonic, as you will, to remember those layers. So we labeled the layers on thick skin. Let me bounce back to our thin skin slides here. On our thin skin slides, it might be a little bit dicier for us to label some of these layers, but let's see what we can do. So I'm gonna draw some circles here. Let's start here with all of our lovely baby hair. What is the name of this layer, this outermost layer of the skin out here? Which stratum are we looking at out here? Yeah, stratum corneum, stratum corneum. So my cells that are completely dead, they're cornified, they're falling off. We can see them here. Next, I can see the purple layer. I love how clear, by the way, I'm going to kind of draw a line around a lot of it. I love how clearly you can see that purple, right? So that purple, these were the cells that were filled with granules. So these were the ones we called stratum granulosum because they're filled with those purple granules. Technically, stratum spinosum would be right underneath that. It's going to be a little difficult for us to find stratum spinosum without first finding stratum basale. Stratum basale, that basement layer. Remind me, what are a few of the things we remember about stratum basale? What do we remember about this one? Yeah, one of those important things about it is where we do mitosis. So new skin, yeah, and it's just one layer of cells. So anything between this bottom layer and this purple layer, anything in between is where we would call it stratum spinosum. So stratum spinosum can vary in size depending on where you are, if we're at the top or the bottom of a dermal papillae. But we've got stratum spinosum in between stratum basale and stratum granulosum. We can do the same kind of thing over here. So let me start pointing right here. What would I call this place right here? Circle it, where I put the end of my line. What stratum would we guess we might be pointing to right here? Any ideas? We got 2 votes. Need some tiebreakers here. Stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum. What do we think? Kaylin's mind is blown. So let me put another arrow for us. Here's another one. And I'll put another one down here. We all know, none of us have said stratum basale. Stratum basale is the one that I labeled down lowest. We all know that. I bet you all could help me out with this one I just added. What's this one right here? This one would be stratum. Yep, stratum corneum. here on the outside, okay? So stratum corneum is all up here. So here's my cum. This is thin skin, so I'm not going to have stratum lucidum for let. So we're not going to let us get sunburned. We're just going to get sunburned. So this purple layer right here, this would be stratum granulosum for getting. So stratum granulosum. And this layer in the middle, underneath the purple layer, but above that bottommost layer, that would be stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum. Here's the big idea. When you're looking at an image of skin tissue, if you don't see stratum lucidum, that layer of clear cells, if we don't see that, we're looking at thin skin. Thin skin still has these 4 layers, so stratum corneum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. Thin skin only has those 4. When we talk about thick skin, then add in that extra layer that you can see right here. This extra layer being stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum. I only see that in thick skin. We haven't talked a lot about this, but I'll mention, in case you haven't found it yet, in the student Google Drive, there are a bunch of folders that have tissue. It's called Tissue Images from Our Slides. There's a whole PowerPoint presentation that's filled with pictures of the skin. So I would recommend going through and trying to practice identifying these layers on thick skin pictures and thin skin pictures. See if we can identify them on tissue pictures like this, because if you can do them on a tissue picture like this, I guarantee you, you're totally good on our skin model as well. So we have a question in the chat asking us to repeat those layers in thin skin. We talked about them from outside in. Let's switch it up and we'll do it together as a class. Let's do it from inside out. So help me out in the chat. The first layer in thin skin at the bottom, what do I call that bottommost layer? Bottommost stratum basale. Yep, stratum basale. And then up above it, we're going to have stratum spinosum, the spiny layer. And then we're going to have our dark colored layer. That's granulosum. Granulosum. And then on the outside, whether it's thin skin or thick skin, we always call that corneum. Yeah, so like we're mentioning in the chat, if we've got thin skin, it's just going to be come get sunburned. Here, we'll underline basal, spinosum, granulosum, corneum. Come get sunburned if we're in thin skin. Otherwise, it's come let's get sunburned if we've got thick skin. All right, so that's all you need to know about the epidermis layer of the skin. We need to know those layers, those strata. We need to know that it's made out of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. When we're talking about the dermis layer of the skin, there are a lot more structures that we need to know when we're focusing on that layer. So I'm going to go through and help you do some labeling of these structures. And as we label them, I will talk to you a little bit about what they do. So you need to be able not only to identify these structures, but also to explain what they do. You've got lab packet activities for both of those. So let's start by talking about these big dark things right here. These big dark things that we're looking at right here, Does anyone happen to know what these are representing for us? Let's start with these. Draw some lines together. Yeah, so these are hairs, right? We've got multiple hairs embedded in this skin in our picture here. So when we talk about hairs, there are two parts to them for you to be familiar with. The first part of them is the part that I actually have labeled. And this is what we would call the roots of the hair, or the root, singular, of the hair. The root of a hair is everything that's underneath the surface of the skin. So all of this is the root of a hair. The part that extends up above it is what we call the shaft, the hair shaft. So let's be real. When we're shaving, we shave off the shaft of the hair, right? Which is why you always have to shave again, because unless we get rid of that root of the hair, that hair is just going to keep growing. It's already there underneath your skin. So the hair shaft sticks out above the surface of the skin. The hair roots are below the surface of the skin. When we're looking at the root of a hair, there are a couple of things that are attached to it. The first thing that we see is right here. So let me do some labeling here. Use blue. So the first things that we see, and we see them attached on all of our hairs, these things with blue circles, these are called sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands. Ooh, I spelled that wrong. Let me fix it so it doesn't throw us off. Sebaceous glands produce something called sebum. Sebum is the fancy anatomy word for oil. So you make oil not only to make your skin greasy, right? That's the way it feels. But you make oil to keep your hair alive, to keep your hair from getting brittle, to keep your skin from getting brittle. So we make that sebum, that oil, we spit it out onto the roots of our hair, and the roots of our hair project out of the skin to form the shaft and bring that oil with it to the surface of the skin. So sebaceous glands are attached to our hairs. The other thing that's attached to our hairs are these little guys right here. These little guys right here that I see are actually muscles. So each of these are muscles. The name for these muscles, they're called the Erector Pili muscles. The Erector Pili muscle. The Erector Pili muscle is what I like to call, in easy words, the goosebump muscle. The goosebump muscle. So the Erector Pili muscle, when it contracts, it pulls on the root of your hair and it makes your hair stand up. When your hair stands up, it pushes on the epidermis, making you have those bumps that you can see. If we were animals, moving our hairs would create a special space between our hair and the skin where we would actually be able to make kind of a heat trap to pull stuff inside. But humans don't have enough hair for that to actually help us. So we get goosebumps, then it doesn't necessarily help us. But yeah, and Kira's saying that she saw this with birds last week too. Yeah, if you fluff stuff up and make this little covered space around yourself, it's kind of like when we put on all of our coats last week, right? So animals do that. They use their version of the Erector Pili muscle to pull stuff up, make a little space, a little heat trap to stay warm. I see a comment in the chat from Fanshin that you're having some issues with seeing the picture. I would say just try going in and out again. I'm not sure why it's doing that to you. Sorry. Erector Pili muscles, they stand up the hair. Sebaceous glands, they dump sebum onto the hair. Let's talk about the other kind of gland that we have in our body, and that's these ones that I see right here. These ones that go all the way to the surface of your skin. So let me label these ones here. These glands are what we call eccrine glands. Eccrine glands. The way you're going to identify an eccrine gland is that it goes all the way to the surface of the skin. These ones don't dump onto your hairs. These ones go straight to your epidermis. And these ones do what we call thermoregulation. Thermoregulation. And again, this is going to be a really important topic in lecture, in lesson number 7. The way that your body stays warm enough or cool enough uses the skin a whole lot. Apocrine glands in particular, they make watery sweat. Watery sweat takes heat with it and helps you to cool off. So these apocrine glands are involved in cooling you off. We're all going to be really grateful for them. And about today, right, when it's going to be in the 70s outside. That's Texas for you. We had no power a week ago today and we were freezing, and now it's like 75 outside. So apocrine glands to the rescue. We're going to help us sweat it off. Oh, ours is 79. Okay, I thought I was joking and I wasn't. That's crazy. Whew. All right, we've talked about our secretions. Talked about sebum, the oily stuff. We talked about the watery sweat that apocrine glands make. The last big things for us to talk about when we look in our picture here are some of our nervous tissue structures that are left over. So let's talk about these ones that are down really low. These ones down really low are something called lamelated corpuscles. Lamelated, or are they called lamellar? What are they called in your packet? Can you help me out? Lamellar. Okay, let me delete that. They have about 5 different names, so I want to make sure I get you the right ones. Lamellar corpuscles. If any of you happen to have taken anatomy in high school, or if you've taken this class before, the other name you might know these guys as is Pacinian corpuscles. Pacinian corpuscles. So if you've never heard that before, ignore that. This is just for any of my friends who took anatomy before. Let's talk about these lamellar corpuscles. These are found down deep, either in the bottom of the reticular layer of the dermis or down in the hypodermis layer, these lamellar corpuscles. Their job is to detect pressure. So think about pressure as I'm holding a bowling ball and it presses down on my epidermis and all the parts of my dermis, and I can feel that pressing. That's a very deep sensation, pressure. So the lamellar corpuscles that are deep down in the skin, these are going to detect pressure. Otherwise, we can see these things up here. I am blanking on the not dead white guy name. Can someone else help me out? What's my other corpuscle listed as in your packet? Tactile. Thank you. Okay. Tactile corpuscles. Here, I'll give you the name that I was stuck in my head. Meissner's corpuscles. Again, ignore that if you've never heard it before. That's as my department chair likes to call it, the dead white guy name. So we're going with the not dead white guy name. Tactile corpuscles. Tactile corpuscles, that's a way better name for them too, because tactile corpuscles help us with the sense of touch. So touch as in you're reading Braille, you're feeling the texture of something. Touch sensations are detected by tactile corpuscles. Those are up very high in the papillary layer of the dermis. Pressure sensations down here with the lamellar corpuscles, because pressure is a really deep sensation that you feel. I think we labeled everything. Is there anything left on this particular one that we need to label? Yeah, Kira has a question. Go for it. Yeah, if you want to draw, that's fine. We've labeled everything else, so you're good. Yeah, so that one is, I believe it's a type of, here, let me see if I can make sure I don't butcher the name. If we have okay, so I think what that's called, and I'll pull it up on a Google screen here. It's ironic because it's my maiden name. Krauss corpuscles or bulboid corpuscles. We're not learning those ones. Uh-oh, my computer's not happy with me. I hope we don't crash again today. So I'm not going to ask you about that one in particular because its location is a little bit dicey. Sorry, can you guys hear me again? My computer did its thing where it died again. So sorry. Okay, so I'm not sure how much you you heard, but here's the name of the not dead white guy name of those things. They're called a bulboid corpuscle, or the person name is a Krauss corpuscle. But either way, we're not learning either of those. So don't worry about that one. The one that's kind of hanging out in the middle of things. This is my favorite Precinian corpuscle because it's so deep. This one's pretty deep as well, though, but this is the one that I really think is the best lamellar corpuscle. Excuse me. Lamellar corpuscle down here, tactile corpuscle up here. We can ignore this one here. There's one other thing as well on this model that you don't have to label, but you are knowing the function of, that I'll just point out since we can kind of see it. These little things up here, yeah, like Kira mentioned, these little things up here are the free nerve endings. Free nerve endings, we're not going to make you label them, but you can kind of see them pretty decently actually in this picture here. These are the things that you can thank when you get a bug bite and it itches. These detect itch. These also detect tickle. So some of those sensations that either you love them or you hate them, or it's like a mixture of the two, that's these free nerve endings as well. So a couple of things that you don't have to label on your picture, but just to mention them too. We definitely don't have to label this one. We do need to know what the free nerve endings do. Yes, yeah, Kira, you're right. They also detect pain. Yeah, lots of sensations that all come together with the free nerve endings. They do a lot of things. Touch for the tactile, pressure for the lamellar corpuscles, and then itch, tickle, pain, all those good things with these ones. I am not going to label all the parts of this model here. You actually have this model split up into 3 different images to make it easier for you to label. So those 3 different images we see over here, I'm going to go to start on the right side. We see thick skin on the right side. We see normal thin skin on the left side. And in the middle, we have something called axillary skin. Axillary skin. Who can remember where the axillary region of the body was? Where's the axillary region? Yeah, exactly. The axillary skin is the armpit skin. The armpit skin. It's important for us to know that because this big thing right here is a special type of gland that we only find in the armpit, or we only find in the axillary region, and that's called an apocrine gland. Apocrine gland. So let me circle it all the way. This really big one is called an apocrine gland. I like to call apocrine gland the body odor glands. These are the ones that aren't active until puberty. Once someone goes through puberty, these start to get active. And we all know what that's like when they get active. It's when you go through that awkward teenager year where you realize, oh, I probably need to start wearing deodorant. Because when these things work, they spit out stuff that has a lot of sebum, a lot of oil in it, but also a lot of proteins. So we spit all this stuff out onto the surface of your skin, and your bacteria that live on the surface of the skin are like, sweet, this is delicious. And they eat it and they make body odor. So apocrine glands not active till puberty, and this is what causes body odor. Why we have to wear deodorant is because of these glands here. All of the other stuff that we've labeled on previous slides, we can see that, or on the last slide, we can see that here. I'll mention that on this slide, you can see that we have a lot of little tactile corpuscles all up here next to that thick skin. We can see those really clearly in here. Hey, by the way, how do I know from looking at this picture, how do I know that I'm seeing thick skin over here? How can I tell? Even if I didn't have this labeled for you, how would you be able to tell that there's thick skin over there? Yeah, exactly. The tip off for me is stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum. Remember that we only have stratum lucidum in thick skin. Yeah, and Kira's right too. We do have a lot, a very thick stratum corneum layer as well. One other thing that I'll mention is when we talk about thick skin also technically doesn't have any hair. Your entire body, everywhere is covered with hair, except for the places with thick skin. So the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, there's not hair there. Everywhere else, there's little teeny tiny hairs, or not so teeny tiny ones, but little hairs everywhere except these places with thick skin. So this is, I see no hair here. I see stratum lucidum. The very thick stratum corneum layer out here, all of these are tip-offs to tell me this is a region with thick skin. One of the things that you're learning about in this week's lesson is about burns. So there are 3 kinds of burns that a person can get: 1st-degree burn, 2nd-degree burn, 3rd-degree burn. 1st-degree burn is what you typically think of with a sunburn. So a 1st-degree burn, that's going to be an issue. Want to take a guess? How many layers would be damaged in a 1st-degree burn based on its name? I promise I'm not being tricky. I like to be tricky, but this one's not. Yeah, a 1st-degree burn, 1 layer of skin damaged. In a 1st-degree burn, we have damaged just the epidermis, just the outside. So your skin will be a little bit rosy. It might peel a little bit. As someone who has very fair skin, I am all too familiar with 1st-degree burns. I am also, however, all too familiar with 2nd-degree burns. How many layers do we think get damaged in a 2nd-degree burn? Yeah, 2nd-degree burn is going to be 2 layers of skin getting burned. So we're definitely damaging the epidermis. We're also damaging down into the dermis. Every time you get a 2nd-degree burn, the way you're going to know is because of the formation of blisters. That's like a underline highlight star idea, a really important idea. 2nd-degree burns, you always develop a blister. The reason that is because the anchors that hold the epidermis and the dermis together, when you get a 2nd-degree burn, we break those anchors apart. And so this blister is actually your epidermis that has floated away from your dermis. We've got a whole bunch of that interstitial fluid from in between the cells that actually leaks into this space. So a 2nd-degree burn, when the epidermis and the dermis separate from each other, forming this blister. A 3rd-degree burn is going to damage all of the skin. Sometimes it's called a full thickness burn. So in a 3rd-degree burn, we typically have burned away the epidermis. It's completely gone. The dermis, the papillary layer of the dermis might be gone too. The reticular layer of the dermis is probably damaged. We might even go as deep as the hypodermis. Hey, so I need your help to figure something out here. Third-degree burns, the places on your body where you get a third-degree burn, those kinds of burns actually don't hurt. Why doesn't a third-degree burn hurt? Any ideas? Yeah, exactly. In a third-degree burn, epidermis is gone, dermis is gone. We're maybe even going all the way into the hypodermis. We burned away or completely fried our cells that would detect the pain. Now, to be fair, they may not hurt at the moment that it happens, but as they're healing, as we're building new nerves to those areas that we burned them, that's going to be very, very painful. So it's not that a third-degree burn never hurts, because it hurts tremendously. But at the time when, like you all told me, we burned that nervous tissue, you may not feel the burn at that site. Now, if you have a third-degree burn somewhere, you probably have some second degrees too, and those are going to hurt like crazy. So again, it's not that you won't feel anything anywhere, but the places where you completely charred through all those nervous structures, there's nothing to detect that pain. So third-degree burns, really terrible because we burned everything. You can see these degrees of burns on our model. What we just talked about over here is that third-degree burn. So notice how there's no epidermis. The papillary layer of the dermis up at the top, that's pretty much completely gone too. The reticular layer of the dermis is highly damaged, and we even see some damage down here, maybe into the hypodermis. This is what a third-degree burn would look like. Hey, over here on this burn, I'm seeing a blister. What degree burn did we say had blisters? How do we get blisters? Yeah, second-degree burns, absolutely. So this is an example of what a second-degree burn looks like, with a blister, a fluid-filled blister inside. So by process of elimination, this is my first-degree burn. And I noticed that because the only part of the skin that's been damaged, looks a little rosy, is that epidermis, that outer layer of the skin. So application of our skin parts, burns, first thing for us to know. Remember that they get their names based on the number of layers that are damaged. Is it just the epidermis? Is it the epidermis and the papillary layer of the dermis? Or is it everybody? Epidermis, papillary, and reticular layers of the dermis, even down into that hypodermis. One other condition for us to be familiar with, and I think we're probably all far too familiar with it, or maybe it's just me. We are looking at a picture here of what it looks like when you have acne. So when a person has acne, here's what a little pimple looks like on the inside. When a person has acne, they develop this area underneath their skin where we have way too much sebum. This oily stuff that I see here is sebum. Do we happen to remember what was the name of the kind of gland that made sebum? What makes sebum? Type some words here. So acne is a problem with sebum, which is the fancy word for oil. Yeah, exactly. And sebum is made by sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands. So what happens with acne is the sebaceous glands make a little bit too much oil, or the amount of oil that they make is normal, but where they would normally spit it out onto your skin gets blocked. So we end up making more and more and more sebum, and suddenly you've developed a whitehead. That there's a bunch of extra sebum inside there, it can't get out onto the skin. Sebum, by the way, besides just keeping your skin moisturized and making it not all brittle, sebum also actually is kind of antibacterial. So its job is to kill any bad bacteria that gets on your skin. So it's not all terrible. It's not all just making us have a greasy face, but it does really suck when that sebum gets stuck inside the skin and generates acne for us. So the other skin condition, besides those burns that we talked about, our other skin condition to be familiar with is acne. And that's an issue with those sebaceous glands. That's all I've got related to the skin. Before we move back to those tissues for this week, are there any skin questions you'd like me to answer? Lesson number 5. Or shoot me a thumbs up or an emoji of any variety. Kira took me seriously. She sent me a ghost. I like it. All right. So what I'm going to do really fast, I think I saw, Christian popped in and he left. He's one of the people I added to the lab, alas. Okay, so what I want to show you now as we round out our time today is we're going to look at the last few types of tissue in the body that we have left. So I'm going to show you my screen. Give it a minute to catch up. All right, it looks like you should all be seeing a tissue slide. Is that correct? I like it, Audrey. Tissue, that's perfect. Get my pointer. Okay. So what we have left to look at today are the types of muscle tissue and nervous tissue. And then we've looked at all the tissue types in the body. We are going to do more reviewing of tissue types next week, so stay tuned for that. But the histology review assignment would be really helpful for you to be working on between now and next week's tissue specific class. We're looking at what we call skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. When you look at skeletal muscle tissue, there are a couple of different kinds of images that we're going to see that show skeletal muscle tissue. Let me tell you some of the characteristics that you're always going to see, though, whether it's this slide or my other kind of slide. Every time we look at skeletal muscle tissue, you're going to see these stripe patterns that we see here. So these stripe patterns that I'm looking at are called striations. Striations meaning it's dark and then it's light and then it's dark and it's light. We will talk about in lecture in lesson number 9 why skeletal muscle tissue looks this way. It's because of how we arrange our proteins that help these cells to contract. So first thing we always see with skeletal muscle tissue are these striations, these stripes. The second thing that we see with skeletal muscle tissue is we see these long skinny cells. So this is actually one long skinny cell that has protein tubes inside of it. So we're seeing some of those individual protein tubes that are all grouped together in one cell. And here's a cell that's next door, and here's a cell that's next door. So when you see striations, when you see stripes like this, and you see cells that are long and skinny, that's skeletal muscle tissue. Personally, I like these skeletal muscle tissue slides a lot better because they show you the individual cells a little bit better. So imagine what we were just looking at, but if those cells had a membrane that wrapped around them. So see how I can still see my stripes on these cells? I can still see those stripes and some more stripes. They look great. I love these slides. What you can also see with skeletal muscle tissue on these slides, though, are all of these little dots. And I kind of like to call these the ants on a log. When you're seeing ants on a log, that's another appearance of skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, the cells have more than one nucleus. So each of these dark spots are the nuclei inside those cells. So I see a long, skinny cell, like we were talking about before, and I see lots of these dark spots on it, and we have those stripes. That's a tip-off for skeletal muscle tissue. Long, skinny cells that are striated, that have stripes. Skeletal muscle tissue. My other kind of striated tissue that has stripes is what I call cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in one place in the body. Who can tell me where I'd find cardiac muscle tissue? Yeah, Kira, Timoteo, they're right. Here, let me pull out my little drawing thing here. Cardiac muscle tissue, only found in the heart. Literally, I don't find it in blood vessels. I don't find it anywhere else. Cardiac muscle tissue, only in the heart. How do we recognize cardiac muscle tissue? First thing that we need to look for is those stripes again. I still see those stripes. So my options are either this is skeletal muscle tissue or cardiac muscle tissue. The way I know that this is cardiac muscle tissue is see these little jagged lines right here between this cell, and I've got some more jagged lines right here, some more lines in between these cells. So these lines that you're seeing here, I'll type it in our chat. These lines are what we call intercalated discs. Intercalated discs. These are connection points between my cardiac muscle cells. So my cardiac muscle cells, notice how they're so much shorter or so much smaller than those skeletal muscle cells were. The skeletal muscle cells, it was one cell in this entire space. There were none of those intercalated discs. I see them all over the place when I look at cardiac muscle tissue. The other thing you'll notice on the slides, by the way, is the fact that in between these cells, we actually have some adipose tissue. So on my cardiac muscle slides, if you're seeing a striated muscle cell, in between those striated muscle cells, you will also see some adipocytes or some fat cells. So that's a good way to distinguish it compared to a skeletal muscle cell where there's not going to be stuff in between. Here's another version of my cardiac muscle tissue slide. This one, it's a little bit harder to see those striations, though there are some places where you can see them. But on this one, you can really see those intercalated discs really well. So see those dark lines that I find all over the place? The other thing about cardiac muscle cells, we kind of hinted at this before, but cardiac muscle cells are branched cells. So in other words, they'll have places that kind of are shaped like the letter Y, and they'd have an intercalated disc here, and that'll branch into another cell that's shaped kind of weird, and that's going to have all of these intercalated discs where these cells meet each other. So the intercalated discs are the places where the cells meet. These cells are all different shapes. If we were looking at skeletal muscle, so let me draw some skeletal muscle down here, we would see those stripes, those striations, but we would also see a whole bunch of nuclei. Remember, with the skeletal muscle tissue, it was the ants on a log. So this one down here is skeletal, whereas I've got my cardiac up here where they're branched and they look a little bit funny. So big thing to check out for with the cardiac muscle tissue, it's those intercalated discs. That's the thing that makes the most sense to look for. Also, potentially some of that adipose in between those cells. So, full disclosure, I hate smooth muscle. It's not my favorite. Although smooth muscle is found in my favorite system, Do you all remember which one was my favorite? I'm sure somebody does. Yep, I'm all about that digestive system life for sure. So smooth muscle is found all over the digestive system because smooth muscle helps us to move our food from our stomach all the way through our gut. So smooth muscle tissue gets its name because it does not have striations. When you look at this type of tissue, you're not going to see those stripes like we saw before. The biggest tip-off to help you tell it's smooth muscle tissue is the size of the nuclei. So if you see all of these kind of purple, dark blue, whatever colors we want to call these things here, these are the nuclei of individual smooth muscle cells. So, oh dear. When we're looking at muscle tissue in particular, in our lab after the midterm, we'll look at how the shape of smooth muscle cells is like this. We call it fusiform. So you're seeing our dark purple spots that we're seeing in the picture. Those are the nuclei that are inside these cells that are squeezed flat together. So lots of cells with very big nuclei. This is smooth muscle tissue. Your guided lesson tells you that you need to make sure that you compare smooth muscle tissue to dense, regular connective tissue. Dense, regular connective tissue. When you compare smooth muscle tissue to dense, regular connective tissue, one of the best tip-offs, the biggest things to look for, is these nuclei. Because when we look at dense, regular connective tissue, you're still going to see a lot of these kind of squigglies that we see here of these cells. But in dense, regular connective tissue, the cells are squeezed really, really thin. So the fact that I see these kind of wide nuclei that you can see here with the little spots inside of them, that's because they have space, because they're expanded. When you look at dense, regular connective tissue, the cells are squeezed completely flat. So it's just going to be a dark line as opposed to the fat nucleus. So make sure you're making the comparisons. I'll type it here in the chat. We need to compare this to dense, regular connective tissue. And again, that guided lesson puts some pictures side by side for you to make sure you're making those comparisons. Here's another picture of smooth muscle tissue. Again, it's not my favorite, like my 4-year-old says. It's not my favorite. Got to eat those peas anyway. So here's our nuclei. We got to learn those nuclei anyway. Smooth muscle tissue. These large nuclei, these elongated cells, no striations, no stripes. That's why it's smooth muscle tissue. Last kind of tissue for us to look at is nervous tissue. And this is one that should be pretty easy to recognize based on its color. Again, we had some other ones that were color ones. This is another color one. When we look at this kind of tissue, nervous tissue has dark cells. So these large blue things, these are the cells called neurons. Around those cells, you can see the little blue dots. Those little blue dots are things called neuroglia, or helper cells. I come down and look at this tissue here. Again, I'm seeing those star-shaped cells that are my neurons. And I'm seeing a little patch of neuroglia, my helper cells, over here. Neurons are the cells in the body that send messages. So all of these little extensions that we see here are what let neurons talk to their neighbor, or many of these extensions are what help a neuron to receive messages from its neighbor. So these weird shapes that we see are all the little extensions that are involved in the processes of sending and receiving messages. Neurons, the big blue spots, neuroglia, the little small blue spots that we see. Another picture to show you. Yeah, Kaylin asked a great connection question. all of these spots here that are receiving messages, they would be covered in those chemically gated channels. Absolutely. Because one neuron is going to spit out chemicals to talk to another neuron. So great connection to make. Absolutely. We cover the membranes of these things in chemically gated channels for us to send messages. Hey, if I zoom in really close, we were talking about an octopus before, right? Here's what I think really looks like an octopus right here. Got a little octopus eye. Check this out. This is the nucleus of a neuron. We can see it here in the lighter color. What would that dark spot in the middle of the nucleus be? Does anyone happen to remember? What's in the middle of the nucleus? Yeah, that little thing called the nucleolus. If you look really close at a neuron, its nucleus and its nucleolus kind of looks like an eye. So you can kind of see it a little bit on this one too, the lighter colored nucleus and then the dark nucleolus in the middle. By the way, the reason these cells look so blue is because they're filled with proteins. So the proteins that are all over on the inside of these neurons help the neuron to send messages. Eventually, you can see how there's little strings, these little stringy proteins that go down here. A neuron makes neurotransmitters, it makes its messages in the cell body, and then it's got to send them away all the way down its long part called the axon. So remember when we talked about the cytoskeleton, the proteins that help to give a cell its shape? Neurons have a ton of cytoskeleton proteins to keep them in this weird shape that we see, but also to allow them to move those neurotransmitters throughout the cell. So nervous tissue, our last kind of tissue. There is a note in the guided lesson. Make sure to compare this to fibrocartilage connective tissue. It's not that it actually looks super similar as much as that's another one where we told you to look at the colors. That's another type of tissue that's blue and pink. So just make sure we don't mix up our blue and pink tissues. It should be pretty easy not to. Vanessa asked me to repeat. I think what you were asking me to repeat, Vanessa, is about the proteins, right? How a neuron has a bunch of proteins that give it its shape, but how it looks so funky, and then also allows it to move messages up and down the cell. All right, that is all I've got for today. What questions do we have before we close out today's class? Questions, thoughts? I will open the floor. Compare nervous tissue to fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage connective tissue. Again, it's not that they really look that similar, but they do have the same colors. So that's why I mention it, just to take a peek, since they're both pink and blue. They do look very different though, I think, but just to be safe. I am pulling up our schedule of classes for this week. Let me pull it over really fast so we can all look at it together. Tomorrow, we are going to be focusing, tomorrow's Wednesday, if we can believe that. Tomorrow, we're going to be focusing on lesson number 5. If possible, please try to at least work through the guided lesson for lesson number 5. It would be great if you can start working on protein folding and disease as well. But please make sure to try to at least have finished lesson number 5 if you can. We're going to work on that. and then we're going to start trying to work on lesson number 6 on Thursday. So we're going to be meeting quite a bit this week, try to catch up a little bit from last time. But for tomorrow's class, again, if possible, try to start working on lesson number 5. I know several of you are still getting ready to take the exam, which is totally fine. Make sure to get it done before 11:59 tonight. So tell yourself mentally it's due by 10:30. That'll give you time in case any technology issues come up. And remember, when you're taking that exam, if you can't get into the exam and it's asking for a password, that is an issue with Proctorio. So use that troubleshooting document to help you get into the exam. I don't think I've heard from anyone that they could not get in after they used that. So you walk through that to get into that exam. I will try to stay up close to the deadline, but no promises because I got the littles at home. But try to get it done soon. If you have questions, always feel free to email me, and we will plan to move into unit number 2 tomorrow. Fanch is asking about the new due dates. Everything should be updated, yeah, in the grade book, or I think it maybe automatically goes on the calendar. There is that new assignment checklist as well. So check that out. I think everything should be up to date. But if you find something that's saying the wrong due date, let me know, because I have to go in and manually change everything. Kira's mentioning something invisible body due this Friday. That's probably the assignment, the integument assignment that would have been due last week, but it's actually due this week. We gave you an extra week on the integument. So that's probably what you're seeing in invisible body. Yeah, so Audrey's mentioning the no spring break thing. So the only thing that actually changed is I gave you more time to complete lesson number 8. I didn't assign any more work over spring break than there would have been, just for the record. I know that doesn't make it feel better when you look at the amount of stuff that's due, but you can totally get it all done before spring break, and then you can actually have a break if you'd like. So I know it looks crazy though, because I just bumped one date to give you more time on it, but then it makes it look like I assigned more work. So I apologize. Yeah, so Kira, I'll give a look after class today and make sure that visible body is up to date. What it should say is this Friday. I maybe didn't change the week number 6 stuff yet, but what it should say is that the integument is due on Friday, and next Friday, I think there's 2 assignments that are due that are related to the lesson number 6 stuff. So I will give visible body a check after class today, and I'll make sure that everything is up to date on that front. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. I hope to see all of our friends that are joining us via recording. I hope to see you tomorrow. Good luck with the exam, and I look forward to moving into unit number 2.